IDOR vulnerabilities. Chances are they're alive and well in your web applications. The bad news is if you're foregoing source code reviews by a security professional and relying on automated scanning tools to detect them, you're out of luck. You won't find them. But hackers do, and they can easily exploit them. And we see from the recent Verizon data breach investigation reports, they are. The good news is, with greater awareness and diligence, IDOR vulnerabilities can be found and resolved. Today, Kyle and I are talking with our good friend, Chris Santori. Chris is an OSCP, an expert penetration tester. He explains what IDOR vulnerabilities are and why automated scanning tools can't detect them. And he gives an on-screen demonstration of a real IDOR vulnerability and shows just how easy it is to exploit them. If data security is important to you and what you do, you don't want to miss the next 10 minutes.
Verizon data breach investigation report for 2020 says 45% of all breaches are related to hacking. 90% of all hacking are through web application. Today, we are going to talk about insecure direct object references, IDOR. IDOR is one of the major vulnerability in a web application. It is in the OWASP top 10 since 2007. Today, we will have the honor to talk to Chris Santori. He is one of the experts in this area.
Well, Chris, hello, and thank you very much for contributing to our video. Let's start with this. What is insecure direct object referencing, or IDOR?
Yeah, so simply put, IDOR is the ability to access data directly from a data source using user-supplied input. So what this means for web applications is usually the ability to make requests to APIs for data that should be restricted, like data of another application user.
And Chris, so how often do you see IDOR problems in the wild?
Good question. So we're definitely seeing with the assessments that I do on web applications, a big increase in these types of vulnerabilities.
So do you see this problem in the smaller or larger companies?
So I think the issue affects both small and large companies because with smaller companies, their applications will be less complex, but they often lack the security resources in-house to find these types of vulnerabilities. With large organizations, even though they may have the security resources on hand, the increased size or complexity of their applications make it difficult to find all the vulnerable areas.
And why are we seeing a rise in this kind of vulnerability?
Well, as Kyle mentioned, this vulnerability has existed for a long time. However, its resurgence, I think, is largely due to a shift in how the web applications function. So in the past, the application servers were responsible for processing and displaying data as well as providing application functionality. But now, more and more applications are simply just returning structured data through API endpoints and then letting the client do all the heavy lifting, usually with JavaScript. So the challenge for developers is ensuring each of these API endpoints are properly secured. Another thing to note is that this type of vulnerability is rarely found with automated vulnerability scanning tools because those tools don't know what types of data you should be able to access. So this means that if organizations are just using some kind of automated security check prior to releasing applications into production, this vulnerability will most likely still be present.
And what causes the vulnerability to occur within web applications?
Well, that's a good question. I think there are two main reasons this vulnerability occurs. The first exists within the application's mechanism for verifying access. So often access to web resources require authentication in the form of either an HTTP request header or a cookie. And the application has to verify two things. One, the user's credentials are valid, and two, the credentials supplied have permission to access the requested resource. So if an error occurs in either of these checks, an IDOR vulnerability will usually be present. Let me show you a simple demonstration that helps explain. In this simple application demo, we show how an IDOR vulnerability might arise. So for this demonstration, we have an application where the URL for an API endpoint is API users and then the ID of the user, presumably. When we make this request in our browser, we get a response with the application user's data. ID user 1, so that's confirmed. The user's name is Bob, and then we have his password and email address. The IDOR vulnerability arises when the application server fails to properly validate the session token when accessing data other than the user's own data. So for instance, if we were to increment this ID, let's say 2, and make a request, but leaving our session ID the same, which should be tied to our user Bob, when we make the request, the response returns data for an entirely different user. And this is the basis for the IDOR vulnerability. So as you can see from the demo, the vulnerability is not hard to exploit, but it can still be pretty serious. Then the second reason IDOR is occurring has to do with the increase in application complexity.
So Chris, how does web application and the API's complexity play in the IDOR problems?
Well, because web applications are becoming increasingly complex, like meaning they're using more and more API endpoints, we're usually seeing that while some of these endpoints are properly secured, there are often a few that aren't. Some applications can have over 100 endpoints, and I think with so many, it's just easy for developers to miss a few.
Okay, so what are the main risks regarding IDOR, Chris?
Right, so the main risk occurs when an attacker is able to access another user's data within like a multi-tenant application. And multi-tenant applications are those that serve multiple unrelated users like Facebook or Gmail. Depending on the kind of data processed by the application and whether the IDOR vulnerability provides read, write, or delete access to that data, can lead to a pretty serious breach for an organization. Another type of risk exists if the IDOR vulnerability enables an attacker to access data with a higher privilege context. For instance, administrative functions or administrative data, and this is typically referred to as privilege escalation. Either way, both are usually very serious issues affecting the organization and its customers.
What can companies do to mitigate these issues?
Well, the short answer is to ensure that each area of the application that accepts requests for data are properly checking both the authorization and the authentication of the requesting user. However, to address a systemic issue, organizations should have a procedure for checking application code prior to its production release. There are numerous ways to implement this, such as like a SDLC that incorporates security checks during development.
Yeah, that's a good point because companies, they should have established secure coding practices and train the developers on how to write the secure code.
Right. So a lot of smaller companies have very flexible development processes. And so a rigorous SDLC with security may not fit with this increase in overhead. So to address vulnerabilities outside the development lifecycle, there are two additional options: source code review by a security professional or a penetration test against an instance of the application running in either a development or QA environment. Source code reviews are tedious but thorough. This can make them more expensive, and a penetration test offers an organization a view of the application through the eyes of an attacker, and sometimes even highlight impact more clearly. However, with a penetration test, they may not discover all instances of a particular vulnerability with a tested application.
Hey, Chris, since you mentioned about secure code review, what is the effectiveness of using the automated static code analysis to do the secure code review?
Right, so great question. It's still important to note that automated tools that check the source code or even a running web application for vulnerabilities are still likely to miss the IDOR issues. This is again because the automated scanners won't understand how your application is structured, and so it won't know what types of data the user should or shouldn't have access to. So it's still best to have the applications manually tested by a security professional.
Do you see IDOR problem getting better or worse? What's your prediction?
Yeah, it's a hard one to answer because I think that the places where the vulnerabilities arise will continue to grow, but the awareness will also grow. So it's hard to know exactly. It's hard to predict, you know, that it will continue. Like it'll always be an issue, right? Like SQL injection is still an issue, and we're like 20 years. It's well, maybe not 20 years, but like 16 years since that was like a new thing. So it'll exist for a long time, but it's hard to say if it's going to get better or get worse. Um, I guess my inclination would be that it's probably going to become more prevalent because it is so difficult to check for with automated tools. So, for instance, if it was a new vulnerability that could be checked via signature, or it could be analyzed through some output, then it could be baked into web application scanners. But I don't really see how that would be possible. So
So,
I don't know.
so it will be a little bit worse for a few more years.
Because I think what's going to happen is that smaller companies will, continue to try to keep up with the latest trends in development, and so they'll be rolling out more and more API type applications, but they won't have the back end support of security to ensure that each of them are protected, or secured.
All right, well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your expert input on this important issue. It's certainly relevant to what we're experiencing out in the field. And Chris and Kyle, thank you very much for your contributions today to this video. I think people will find it very helpful, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul and Kyle, for having me. I really appreciated it, and it was a pleasure.
We'd enjoy hearing your feedback on today's discussion. Please leave a comment below and click the like button. And please let us know your suggestions about topics of interest you'd like us to cover in our next videos. We're cybersecurity consultants who help clients mitigate and resolve the type of issues we discuss in these presentations. We understand business organizations operate within budgetary constraints. We help identify cyber risk based on criticality and provide solutions that are cost-conscious, budget-friendly, and can be phased in over time. You can contact us through our website, and we hope that you will. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and be well, everyone, and happy 4th of July.